Hello, everyone. This is Ernie Humphrey. I'm the CEO and COO of Treasury Webinars. I want to welcome everyone to our webinar today, Identifying and Taming Payments Fraud Exposures, Technology, Tools, and Employee Education. Topic has always been important. It's seen much greater importance, especially the past 3 or 4 years when COVID started to kick in. We had a lot of people working remotely, so companies were exposed to a lot more payments risk exposures, and some of that, and even identifying those as people work remotely and as our environment changes has been challenging. But also with the explosion of AI and chat GPT, we're also seeing a lot of other emerging exposures, which you might not have thought of. So it's really important topic for everyone across the entire organization. It's not just a treasury issue. It's not just an accounts payable issue. It's not just an IT issue. A lot of what it really gets down to, a lot of the risk involved are really related to how all those that impact any part of your payments process are interacting with the outside world. So that's a little bit different perspective. So before I dive in, I want to thank my thought leadership partner for today's webinar, Esker. They share my commitment to thought leadership, but more importantly, they share my commitment to impacting the career success of those who use their product. So thank you so much for your partnership, Esker. A little bit about our agenda today. So we're going to just run through some payments fraud trends. There's a lot of surveys out there. There's a lot of great surveys out there. So I'll review some of the survey results from 2 surveys that I found particularly valuable. It's more about giving you some context. And if you want to dive into the surveys, I have the links there. A lot of what we'll talk about today is to ask you to take a look in the mirror. Probably will facilitate some conversations that you want to have internally after the webinar, ask the questions, and really see, okay, where your company is at, where do they need to be, and how are you going to get there. So success for me is to get all of you to take an action at some point after the webinar, but also to introduce to you a little bit of a different perspective. So there's a lot of webinars on payments fraud, so I'm going to try and marry what I see as the best of the best, talking about the emerging technology side, talking more about the employee education side, but also really bringing things back to what I consider the blocking and tackling. So if you would have seen a payments fraud webinar of mine or a lot of folks, you would have seen a lot of folks reviewing surveys from the AFP and a few others, and we would say, okay, we're going to look at fraud related to checks and wires and ACH. We'll certainly touch on that, but we want to give folks a little bit of a different perspective, and it also makes the topic a little bit more exciting. So again, we'll talk about trends, we'll talk about sources. I'll give you my thoughts on framework. It's actually enlightening to look at these sources, right, in different ways, how you slice and dice them. I like to frame it in terms of internal fraud sources, external fraud sources, and then technology. Of course, those 3 sources kind of overlap and fuel each other, but that's the way I like to look at it. Keep it simple. You can also easily frame it in terms of people, process, and technology, whatever works for you in your organization. But to me, it all starts with having what I would call a really intensive mapping of all of your payments, processes, and procedures, everyone that's involved in the payments process internally, potentially externally, all the systems that are involved internally, externally, and then all of the processes that can be involved internally, externally. And then again, this is the step that we have to take in today's world. How are those involved internally in any part of our payments process interacting with the other world, with the outside world? So how are they interacting via social media, on LinkedIn? We have to even get them ready for people to maybe reach out to them on Facebook. So it's a different world. So we have to communicate to them some exposures they may be introducing themselves to in the company to in ways that they didn't think. And a lot of times those will come in through emails or messaging. So that's important that we have employee training, a lot of employee training around that. We'll talk about how to mitigate certain risk exposures, and then we'll talk about talking about some things that you can use right away to help mitigate payments risk at your company. Of course, this could be a 10-hour webinar. So again, there's a lot of resources in here, a lot of information to take in. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me after the webinar, or I can take your questions. In the questions area of the GoToWebinar channel, there is a lot to cover, and I want to make sure that we cover the bases. If you're interested in receiving a copy of today's presentation or a certificate of attendance for attending the webinar today, please send an email to ernie@treasury.webinars.com. If you indicated on the way in on the registration you'd like a certificate of attendance, I will get that out to you immediately following the webinar. Again, if you'd like a copy of the presentation or certificate of attendance, please send an email to ernie@treasury.webinars.com. We will also be getting the webinar recording posted on the ESCERT website in the next few days. So for those of you who might need to convince folks internally why you need to pay attention to payments fraud, well, payments fraud is rampant. We'll show some statistics there, not surprisingly. Your company is at risk. Your company writes checks, almost a vast majority of you, especially those my US colleagues. So if you write checks, your company uses email, guarantee you do that. Your company has people-related exposures. They do. You have process-related exposures. Your company has technology-related exposures. Fraud schemes are constantly evolving, and I think that's just blown up as far as we can possibly even imagine, as people and fraudsters as well are becoming more versed in leveraging AI, and we'll talk about that as well. And then you got to know your exposure grows as your business grows. As you get into certain types of payments, different types of payments, go into different markets, you're going to be introducing new risks to your organization. And as you introduce more people into your organization, you may have to add people in order to facilitate your payments processes across the globe. So that will add risks as well. Fraudsters do fraud all day, every day. These people don't sleep, so we have to have our guard up. And then you can and will lose customers if your company falls victim to payments fraud and they lose the payment. So there's a lot of reputational risk out there as well. So just food for thought for those of you who run into a colleague and say, I don't know why payments fraud is important, but there's a lot to cover. So payments fraud is still rampant. A couple surveys. One of them we'll look at is some results from the 2023 Treasury Fraud and Control Survey report from my friends Strategic Treasurer. I have the hyperlink there. It's a very good read. They also have a lot of other great content at Strategic Treasurer. Craig has recently introduced a framework for companies to really look at payments fraud mitigation and management holistically. So I encourage you to take a look at what they have at Strategic Treasurer. So in their survey, 73% of companies experienced fraud or expected fraud over the past 12 months. I think that number was higher last year, but it's still significant. And this one is really eye-grabbing to me. 78% of companies believe that the fraud threat level has increased significantly over the past 12 months. 20% significantly, 58% said it's increased. So this kind of shows it's important. If it's not a priority to your company, it really should be. And then there's another survey that we'll talk about. So some of the results, it's called Fraud in the Cyber Era, 2024 Fraud Trends and Insights. I discovered this survey. It was developed and communicated by TrustPair. Just to note, TrustPair's survey was really targeted at enterprise-sized companies. So that's important because if people are doing it in enterprise-sized companies, first, they're facing the same issues that you're facing, but I also want to note that the issues that are being faced are that people are going at companies of all sizes. So from their survey, 96% of companies, the enterprise companies, targeted with at least one attempt, and then 67% expect fraud to increase. So people, you're being targeted. It's going to increase. So this deserves your attention. And 90% of companies that were targeted incurred a loss. Let that sink in for a minute. So you really have to have your defenses up. And even if you have your defenses up, you still may incur a loss. And that's why we'll talk about this. You also need to have a plan in place for that response as well. This seems out of the purview of Treasury, but it's really not, or AP, right? So it's important that we look at a holistic approach. Again, we want to be collaborating accounts payable, accounts receivable, right? Of course, we want to have our IT folks involved, treasury involved. So we have to take this holistic approach. And then if we have to get marketing involved as well, because we need to understand emails are being sent out, or they're being sent out from our domains. So our websites, our social media presence. So we have to have that holistic approach, because the weakest link is where people are going to find that weakest link is, and that's what they're going to expose. And then from the survey, 78% of companies incurred multiple losses, and 36% of those with the loss more than $1 million. So that's an enterprise company, but that's still a huge number. If you are in Treasury, let's say, for example, and you experience fraud with a check or a wire or whatever, this can be a career defining event for you. So if you don't have tools in place, it could be damaging to your career, or could lose your job because of that. So it's important that we all have our eyes on our payments risk processes from A to Z, and understand those exposures and manage those accordingly. So let's look at some sources here. This is from my perspective. I like to look at it in terms of internal exposures, look at things within the walls of your office. Again, to me, that's about people, right? Who's involved, proving their actions within work, their actions outside of work, maybe on LinkedIn, emails they're sending, opening external exposures, your partners, those that are attacking you from the external sources. We'll talk about things such as BEC, business email compromise, and many other things. And then just technology in general, and that can be either internal or external, and the solutions that are being leveraged internally, and solutions being leveraged by your partners. And of course, technology. I want to really emphasize once again that I don't think in the past we've talked enough. We talk about VEC, but email is really a key point where a lot of fraud is targeted, and that's where a lot of fraud is successful. So when we look at technology, we want to really talk to IT about the email security, and we'll talk about some ways to do that as well. So internal sources, you can look at it in terms of departmental. So we look at our accounts payable team, anyone that's involved in creating a payment, making a payment happen, looking at invoices, approving invoices, changing invoice amounts. Are they changing bank account information? Who's allowed to do that and why? Of course, we have Treasury. Those are folks who can approve payments depending on your company. Sometimes companies allow one person to approve a payment. They can change beneficiary information. They can change wire transfer templates. And then also a risk that people don't think about is also your bank account signatories. So sometimes we don't have enough communication with those. Those of you who have operations overseas, you may not have a lot of interaction with your bank account signatories, but we need to make sure that they are aware and things that they should do and can't do. It's possible that someone can find the bank account signatory in another country, send them a phishing email or something of that sort, and then get some sort of wire transfer payment made. And you're not really thinking, oh, John's over in Europe, he's on this account that we never use. Well, that's where you can face fraud. So we want to make sure that we realize that those folks can affect payments, even though they might not be in our normal processes. Those people have the authority to do so. And then, of course, we want to look at our payroll, procurement, AP hand in hand, but then also we need to be looking at, on the accounts receivable side, potentially money coming in and maybe money being misrouted. Those who are giving our bank account instructions to our customers. No offense, salespeople, but all the people that might be doing that, they have to all those exposures as well. So look at those internal sources, house in order. Of course, we also mentioned all the technology that we're using as well to communicate internally, to route those payments, approve those payments as well. And we can also start to look at the email as well. So just emails going back and forth between the departments. Fraudsters have the ability to find out, even on LinkedIn, I can probably find out who the AP people are at your company, the AR people at your company. I can find the procurement person, I can find the payroll person. And if I'm really versed, I can act like I'm one of your employees communicating to another one, not outside of it. Hey, Jen, I need you to approve this. Hey, John, maybe just asking you information. What's the bank account information? What's the routing number? What's the password? How do we get into XYZ? So we have to be educating our employees on things of that nature as well. So that's one way to look at it. Internal sources, and then we'll talk about this. How do we mitigate all those sources that come about from people that work in those departments or across those departments? Again, the larger framework, that whole set of process from A to Z. So internal sources, just to give you a little bit more to take away. So again, if you'd like a copy of the presentation, please send an email to Ernie@chargywebinars.com. A lot of this is just to get you thinking about it. These are all potential sources: who inputs supplier information, who can edit it, who approves changes to supplier information. A lot of companies are looking towards supplier portals where this is done much more securely. And in some cases, the ownership of that information is going to fall on the suppliers. You have to make sure that they have that buttoned up in their end, but they realize that that's their responsibility as well. If you're looking at invoices, who's involved in approving an invoice when it comes to be paid, who can make changes, who can approve changes, the payment execution, who controls when the payment is made, who can approve a change when a payment is made, who can change the amount of the payment, who can change or approve the bank account beneficiary data. So all those things offer internal sources. The research that I've seen, probably before the last few years, there was much more incidence of internal fraud and internal fraud attempts. And now we're seeing a shift because of technology and email and social engineering and BEC explosion, that it's not quite as much as it was in the past, but it's still very important. Again, when you look at the whole risk management strategy there, you got to make sure your weakest link can cause a lot of damage. And if you don't look at these things that, oh, you think, oh, we definitely have supplier information buttoned up. Yeah, we have checks, we have positive pay. Just make sure that those things are actually in place. People understand that they are working and how to use those tools. And then payment execution, continued, who can approve payments? How can payments be approved? Can we do that remotely? Is it an email? Okay, how do we make sure those emails are valid? Can we do it via voice over the phone? Now we've got deep fakes, so we have to be careful about that. How can that be done over the phone? Can we verify the caller ID? How do we make sure it's actually the person? And then who manages how payments are improved in terms of the number of approvals, the dollar amounts that impact the workflow. So all those are what I would consider internal sources. And then your external sources with who you interact, I'll use the word counterparty, is because it puts people in a group together. Your suppliers, your vendors, your bank, your fintech solutions provider, any external systems that you're connecting to, using, that have interaction that even within your company walls. This, I like to again point out the social media part, or people in your company posting on LinkedIn, posting on TikTok, hopefully or not, posting on TikTok, but just things like that. What about the external processes? If you're using an outside vendor, do they have PCI DSS compliance? Are they SOC2? And the bottom two are things which I think companies are focusing more and more on, and that's where I think this is where the training I think is the most important, are the emails and social media. We're going to lock things up as much as we can. I believe we need to have education. We need to have testing on all these different scams. We need to test our folks and make sure they understand that. We also need to have meetings that just communicate to people how pervasive this is, how emails can really cause damage, and what they do on social media, they can be divulging information and they're not really aware of what they're doing that. So especially on the company time, we have to make sure that they're doing things with purpose or not doing things with exposures, but also if maybe even if they're using social media apps, they also need to be careful of folks that are reaching out to them, because they may be nefarious people and they may be able to find out, hey, so-and-so works at accounts payable, I'm going to become her buddy, and then I'm going to get he or she to divulge something. So obviously we talk about technology, we'll use the term cyber fraud, technology related. This information is from the Strategic Treasure Survey. I apologize, I didn't get that site on the slide. 83% of companies were targets of cyber fraud. The top three We're wire fraud, vendor fraud, CEO fraud. So that gives us some type and then channels, right? Fraudsters. So obviously we need to train our folks things that we are not used to seeing: text messages, fake websites, and phone calls. So a lot of this can be conveyed in education and training, which should be done. You can do this internally. You can hire consultants as well. I strongly believe that testing and employee education is the strongest deterrent. It's definitely the most cost effective. So let me go ahead and launch our first polling question here. Just want to get your sense. So we talked about internal, external, and technology exposures. Would love for you to just share with us what you feel is the most relevant for your company, where that greatest risk may lie. If you're interested in receiving a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, you'll have to answer all of our polling questions. Again, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, please send an email to ernie@chargywebinars.com. Go ahead and keep the polling question up for another few seconds or so, but then I'm going to have to give you the preview. I watched my first March Madness game last night, so I'm already in March Madness mode. You already know Purdue's going to win it all this year, so I root for the Boilermakers. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up. I'll give you a little countdown here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, a couple more seconds because as people are still voting. Thank you. 2, 1. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing that, doing that for us. So we have external exposures, which is what I would expect, just given all the attention to this AI and things that are going on out there, and because of the prevalence of again, business email compromise and deep fakes. And again, all of these are related as well, and where your concerns may be involved in the type of business that you're in, the size of your business. So thank you so much, everyone, for sharing that information with us. All right, so let's talk about some specific threats. Again, there's a lot of ways to slice and dice threats and what they are and how to mitigate them. So we'll definitely talk through those. So we'll dive in on these in future slides. We have business email compromise. I've talked about that. Social engineering. I talk a little bit about deep fakes. We'll talk about system breach, and then we'll get into a little bit on ransomware. So business email compromise is really when there's some sort of fraud being perpetrated via email. Someone is trying to incentivize the person to take an action that is going to put the company at risk or going to cause financial harm to the companies. A common type of what people have seen and we still see is called vendor email compromise. The scammers impersonate employees at a third-party company and target a finance department. So they're trying to get an invoice approved. So there's just a little example here on the right, and this is seeing great success. There are some well-known studies with some big companies that have been hit by this. And so fraudsters, they impersonate outside, they impersonate your colleagues, they'll impersonate your bank partners, and they convey a sense of urgency and consequences for an action. They'll put some pressure on someone. If it's a colleague, if they can see the emails, if they've gotten in your system and can see what emails are going out, they can use the same verbiage that someone used. Maybe someone calls you a different name or a nickname. So when you're training people and talking about business email compromise, you want to make sure that people are looking for these types of things. Of course, common things are people might change the domain name, the @ right, XYZ supply. They might put an extra E or S. Really look at who that's from. And then another thing on any type of fraud attempt, get people's radar on. The first thing they need to do is get that radar tuned in. And then if you ever have any question about whether this is fake or not, or fraud or not, do not take action. Call someone on the phone, whether that's your manager, whoever that designated person is, whether it's your risk department. You may have a team dedicated to fraud mitigation. It's that serious at companies. So the best thing to do is to teach people to have their radar up and then pause. So let's take a pause. Let's confirm whatever that looks like. So business email compromise, again, several types there. And then as far as risk mitigation, some things like especially with online systems, a two-factor authentication, especially if you're going into a system to do anything, right? Move money, change account information, anything that can impact money going in and going out, or how it's coming in, or reroute that money. Two-factor authentication. There's other emails as well, and this is one that I think companies need to pay more attention to. And if you're in Treasury, let's make sure that we talk to our IT team on our email security measures. Those of us that do a little marketing, these are things that are familiar with us. There's things to work on your outgoing emails, right? So they're not in they're not tagging in your system and sending emails directly from your system. They have a SPF, it's called SPF, and they have domain identified email. So it proves outbound email, the latter by adding a signature. And then for inbound emails, this is important for your IT team to work with them. Domain message authentication, reporting, and conformance, DMARC. It recreates robust email security. It sets verification rules that inbound emails must meet to avoid rejection. The other side of that is you need to make sure that your inbound emails aren't set too tight so you don't miss important messages. But we need to be looking at email security. We already talked a lot about employee training. We want to raise awareness and teach them how to separate emails, legitimate, illegitimate, and then just training through phishing simulations and other tactics. We need to talk to everybody about hard to break passwords anytime they're getting into a system, especially a company system, but also teach them how to have that mentality in all their systems as well, and their social media as well. And then your infrastructure, your company should have an updated infrastructure and network tools and operating systems in order to help mitigate the risk, all the risks that are caused by communicating electronically via email. And then social engineering VEC is a type of social engineering. People to take an action is detrimental. Get people to share confidential information, clicking on links, initiating or approving payments. I have a good article source for you here. 10 types of social engineering attacks from CrowdStrike. They have some good information there. Just some names. If you want to go on the website and take a look at what these things are what these terms are in case you hear them, and get your folks familiar with them. I think we've all heard of phishing is pretty common, whaling, and tailgating, piggybacking. So those are just some of the common schemes. So it's good to stay on top of those type of schemes and make sure your folks are informed. And then deep fakes is it's really more out there in terms of impersonating celebrities and things like that. But the part of it that scares me, and just in the video, is the audio. So again, taking a phone call from someone, AI, it'll sound exactly like your boss or the approver. So we have to be very careful there. And then a type of deep fakes is called business identity. So these people create corporate personas, right? That's what I said. You're imitating existing employees, so can have financial and reputational risk. So again, we need to make sure that we are up to speed on some of those events that are happening. I think we're getting more attention on deepfakes just because of the AI side of it, and it's just more newsworthy to the general public. It's important, but again, I wouldn't get too wrapped up in allocating all this time to deepfakes when there are other areas that we can be focusing on, as you've seen already, all the sources of payments risk exposures that we have. Ransomware, we've all heard the stories. It's a malware that gets on your computers and encrypts the data on a computer, and then it can go beyond a computer. Ransom is demanded to release files with payment, often required in Bitcoin. And so part of that is teaching people, right, email best practices and other exposures where people can have access to their computer, and more importantly, when their computer communicates with the systems in your organization remotely, that's where we can have some disastrous results as well. And then if you want to learn more on ransomware, I've got a good article there from Tech Radar. They've got some good resources there. And then just some more data, like just to give you a sense of fraud experience. This is from the Strategic Treasurer survey. Just look at the different types. So BEC, right, is 68%. That's leading the way. Then we have social engineering, and then we have cyber fraud, data theft, malware. So all these are significant. Payment diversion, right, making a payment go where it wasn't intended to go in some way, whether it's out the door or routing it through maybe an intermediary bank. And then we still have 16% ransomware as well. So those are just things to look at there. So the attempts, again, the attempts are highest here, and then a loss was suffered. And we see the BEC and payment diversion as well. We need to be aware of all these different types of fraud and ask ourselves, it's really a mentality. I talk about this later on as well. We find out what tools are available, and the question should be, why aren't we doing this, as opposed to why would we do this? So it could be cost benefit, but that's the perspective that I believe makes the most sense. Why aren't we doing this? Why is this not relevant for us? Why is it not worth it? Why isn't it worth it for our company? And so then we look at, again, I mentioned off the top that remote work has changed some of the risk exposures. So a really insightful question they asked at the Strategic Treasure survey was, excuse me, which types of exposures do you believe increase with remote work? We have business email compromise, data theft, external threat, right? So we just see that. So this is a good thing to just ask yourself, right? This question. Let me look it through my company lens. Which of these exposures has increased? What have we done about it? Right? What haven't we done about it? What should we do about it? And then this also is good in a sense that it gets us in a mindset of we not only need to identify and understand and help manage existing exposures, but what about emerging exposures? So it gets you in the mindset I talked about earlier. Oh, we're going into a new country. We're looking into real-time payments. We're looking at doing a payments factory. I need to look at the risk. So certain things in technology, they may mitigate or eliminate a certain set of risks, but they also may introduce a new type of risk that you hadn't experienced before. And then let's dive into payments fraud mitigation. So let me go back. I want to get to the technology for the education side a little bit, just asking you to share your reaction. The people in your AP function are well educated relative to payments fraud. Strongly agree, neither agree or disagree, strongly agree. I mentioned this earlier. To me, this is what we see as the front lines and the target. To me, I would want to see those involved, any person involved in the payments process, right? I talked about it, whether you're in information, you're impacting information, it has anything to do with money coming out the door, coming in the door, approvers and signatories. We want to make sure that they're all well educated, because we don't want to create any really weak links for the fraudsters to find and expose. So again, if you'd like a copy of the presentation, please send an email to ernie@treasurywebinars.com. I'll give you guys a few more seconds, and we'll take a quick peek here. All right, we need a few more people to vote. Come on, just click the button for me. Appreciate it. All right, they give you the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right. Share the results real quick. Thrilled to see 35% of you strongly agree. And anyone else on there, I would say this deserves another look for you after the webinar is over. Hopefully we have inspired you to really show the importance of them all being educated, but then also those of you who strongly agree with AP, then you kind of ask yourself the follow-up question, oh, do others involved, do my approvers understand? So just take that out to all those that impact your processes and your systems involved. on the payment side, and you may have a different perspective. And then give these folks the same level of training and attention. So thank you everyone for sharing your insights with me there. And then I just wanted to show, this is more of a thought provoking. This is from an older strategic treasurer survey. Sometimes people say, well, am I going to see a benefit from investing in this type of training? And then these are just some of the training payoffs that companies have seen when they asked folks back in the 2020 report, just the multipliers, right? Cybersecurity fraud, ransomware 5 times. And then the survey showed that 70% train their employees on security annually. I would love to see that number be 100%. It's not why are we doing this, it's why not. And especially with all the changes in technology going on now, and all the moving pieces and parts and regulations all across the board, we really also need to talk about, take things back to supplier onboarding. There's a lot of risks there. OFAC restrictions. So are you even supposed to be doing business with folks, and what are the consequences of that? And how do we vet those folks as well? So there's a lot of exposures there, and a lot of places where technology can help us all. And yes, I'm going to mention checks. Checks are still important. How do we help mitigate that? Positive pay, payee positive pay. You send a file to the bank. It has the beneficiary name and the amount of the check, and then it comes through, and if there's a mismatch, you get a notice and it says approve or not approve this. Very important. There's other things that we can use. Yes, people write checks. 30% of companies still prefer to write checks, and 30% of companies still prefer to pay by check. That's my own survey work I've done. And then, but here's the other thing why I think checks really matter. I'll show you on the next slide. Dun, dun, dun. Oh, what's that? That's my company. This was like a couple weeks ago. So there's a check fraud for you. And one of the things that really helps spurn the amount of check fraud you might get is the ability to do a remote deposit. So if someone was able to get the routing number and the bank account number off of my checks, not my checks, just my company, sometimes it's not all that hard to find. So this just shows you, me, doesn't matter if you're a small company, you write checks, you never write checks, it doesn't matter. You have to have the controls in place in case something like this comes along. If this slips through and gets paid, then guess what? You're going to have a bank investigation, and you'll probably get your money back, but it's going to take you 60 days, and the number's going to be a lot higher than that. So I just wanted to share my personal pain with you. There it is, Treasury practitioner. I showed you guys there. This is still going on. Again, with remote deposit, that creates new risks. So don't go to sleep on those of you that write checks, accept checks. Again, you don't even have to be involved in checks. Make sure you have controls on your bank accounts. So it's a public service announcement. So for ACH fraud, some things to do: reconcile accounts daily. You can put some blocks on your account, ACH debit blocks. You can decide which things can get through and can't get through. Some things you cannot block, like government payments, but we always had ACH debit blocks on all of our accounts when I was in Treasury. BEC scams. So there's just a lot of different ways. These are evolving, but this is a good list from AFP, their frauds and control survey in 2020. Education, verification. Again, it's really the approval process. Emails, doing things at emails, internal controls, confirming requests. So just having things in place. For one, and look at the AP side. This is the most important. Stop it before it gets out the door. And then, what do we do if it gets out the door or is in the approval process and is about ready to get out the door? So that's important. So we talked about reconciliation, just bank accounts. Just a word to the wise: a lot of people do not reconcile their bank accounts. Best practice is to reconcile your bank accounts daily. We have tools out there to help us do that. We look at, here's just some security principles that we should be paying attention to, and there's no reason not to be doing these. Segregation of duties and all things related to payments. Work with our IT folks. Firewalls, encryption of data, We talked about multi-factor authentication, employee training and testing. On this, I talked a little about earlier, we got to look at sanction screening, and then we'll talk about this a little bit. There's a lot of technology, AI and machine learning on how to track and detect what we call anomalous behavior. Sometimes people think I have anomalous behavior. Um, a good way to help control fraud is to have a policy around fraud that describes all the things that are in place and why they're in place, and make sure that everyone is following the policy. So it's understandable, people know about it, and people need to know that it's enforced, because if it's not adhered to, then there's going to be consequences. And then you have to let people know that you are on top of fraud. So we do monitor fraud. Don't even try it, right? You're going to get fired, you're going to get caught. And then another piece in Treasury would be a frauds and control framework, right, around that fraud policy. So the fraud policy, you can have them two separate, you can have them in one policy as well. Again, it doesn't matter if you don't have them, if no one understands them and no one is following them. So we need to make sure we look at this and get it, make sure there's compliance to that. And then there's ways to have accountability. So to be able to track fraud and stay on current development. So, right, so this is actually part of your job function. Someone is responsible for staying on top of the training programs, communicating what the procedures are, what they should be. So there's a group responsible for reporting. They address fraud attempts, communicate those, monitor developments, right? And then we want to make sure that we have folks that are it's part of their job responsibility, and they're accountable for that. Make sure that we're monitoring and managing and mitigating fraud. And another point, which I haven't made yet, is oftentimes it takes 6 months or longer for people to even realize that they've had any type of incursion occur, and then to see the consequences of that. So a lot of times someone might be kind of in there laying in wait. So we need to make sure that we are ready to respond. But again, we want to work on identifying that fraud as soon as possible. So interesting from the fraud in the cyber survey, just what companies list as their top challenges: employees not following policies. That's great. We need to make sure we have the right policies. We need to establish accountability, siloed processes, blocking collaboration. That's almost 50% as well. And so again, for me, this is we want a holistic approach to payments fraud. It's not, we're doing this in Treasury, we're doing this in AP, we're trying this in AR, IT is doing this. We have this going on in marketing. We have this in HR because it's payroll. So we need to have that holistic approach. And again, I would say it goes to the company-wide approach. Just anyone that's a company that has email, right? These people need to understand the consequences of them clicking on whatever they might not target someone in finance. They may target someone who they think is the most likely to open an email. Maybe it's a new hire. Maybe they find out someone is disgruntled on LinkedIn. Some people share that, so they're going to open an email. So the people are very nefarious in what they're doing. And then the third one was unreliable third-party data. And then tools to mitigate exposures, just kind of looking at what the investment of companies are. So according to the Strategic Treasure Survey, 56% have seen an increase in budget dedicated to fraud prevention technology. So that's good to see. So that's something that you should be looking to do. So it's a benchmarking thing. Other companies are doing this. We should plan to do the same. And then when we look at the fraud in the cyber era, that's more of that enterprise data they're looking at. So 27% on fraud prevention, detection, controls, and 3% significantly more. I would love to see that number higher. I think that when people take a good look in the mirror, it's thing that they're going to realize that they have exposures that need to be addressed. And then again, a lot of times you'll have an exposure, but when business changes, when technology changes, those exposures become greater. A lot of companies found out the hard way when they had weak points in their accounts payable process. When COVID hit, they weren't ready. And that's why we saw such a mass adoption of AP automation as COVID began to hit. And it's still, that momentum is still there, as it should be. So let's take a look at a little bit. I like this. This is because if you're looking at, I would say emerging, some emerging, but fraud prevention tools, because these are terms that you might hear about. So again, from my friends at Strategic Treasurer, a lot of these technologies and frameworks, you look at prevention and then detection, right? Prevent it from happening and then detect it. So we look at fraud prevention. AI and ML mean artificial intelligence or machine learning, and fraud detection, and then this rule-based AI and ML, and then the behavioral profiling uh, identifies things that are out of the ordinary for someone or even for a client or a customer. So maybe there's an invoice for a company. For years and years, we've had $500, and then all of a sudden it's $50,000 in that range. So anything that's out of the normal for what we've seen from activity from a specific company, it can be specific to an employee. Maybe they're sending a lot of emails back and forth. Maybe there's language in there. And then we have biometrics and fraud prevention, biometrics. So my assistant needs to do spell check. No, kidding. I don't have an assistant. So this is just interesting data. Again, it's a great read from Strategic Treasurer. So we have no plans, exploring, implement. So it's good to see that we see such a high percentage, at least exploring. So we see, exploring plans to implement really high across the board. So we are seeing some attention and some traction for these AI and ML based fraud prevention techniques. But again, let's make sure that we are applying this great technology to all these different types of exposures and not get caught up in biometrics and we might invest money in that, but then we don't have positive pay. So let's have that mentality. But really interesting to look at it right through these different lenses of all this emerging technology, but we still have the same sources of risk that we had before, so we can't take our eye off the ball. And behavior profiling is more important than ever because that behavior really exposes the company to risk types of behavior no one would have dreamed of. An old guy like me, I don't even think we had email back when I was really starting off my career. Who would have imagined all the cans of worms that's opened, the social media, just the technology that fraudsters use is incredible. And then this is interesting too. This is from Fraud in the Cyber Era. Uh, what the banks wish that the companies would do. So let's think about that. Payment control services. We talked about reconciling the calls, dual controls, and security training and testing. So these four pillars are the basics, which I would look at. Okay, are we doing these things? This is what I would consider the things that we need to start with. We might not be able to go from A to Z, but I guess what we want to do is look at what are all the exposures, where do we have the weakest links, and then we can prioritize closing some of those links. And technology can absolutely help us close some of those or mitigate some of those risks that we have if we have the right technology and the right process and automation, and also the tools that allow us to have that audit trail and that tracking. And that AI and ML helps us really react in real time, which I think is critically important to keeping things from going out the door. So now I'm going to go ahead and take a few minutes for some takeaways. Again, we had a lot of content to cover as usual. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, please send an email to ernie@treasurywebinars.com. Companies of all sizes definitely invest in understanding current and emerging payment risk exposures. So let's make sure that we make that investment in identifying those and really understanding what they are, and then look at how others are dealing with them and how we can mitigate those as well. So there has to be a commitment by the organization, and it's best practice if someone in the organization that really falls under their purview and their responsibility. We want to take a holistic approach to payments risk management. We have these exposures related to systems, processes, and folks that work in AP, Treasury, AR, audit, risk leaders, right? All these different areas. So we want to make sure that we have a holistic approach and look at the actions that they take, monitoring the actions that they take, monitor risk that they have as exposures in terms of what they can do, but also how they communicate, how they interact on social media as well. And again, let's really look at those email practices. We want to tighten up how things go out. We want to tighten up on how things go in. Our folks need to understand how to recognize something that might be nefarious and then teach them to pause, ask a question, contact someone, and make sure that they don't get guilted into doing something. A sense of immediate urgency, verify, verify, verify. And then again, the mindset, I just talked about that. You say, why are we not doing this? That's a good mindset. Educate employees involved and how they directly and impact payment risk exposures. Again, these are the actions that you take that can impact that, especially the actions that you can take on platforms such as LinkedIn, and then our marketing people as well, the actions that they're taking as well. Educate people how to identify specific threats, again, what to do about it. Create a fraud policy that's communicated, understood, and enforceable. Highly recommend you test your payment processes by introducing threats that may come internally or from outside parties to assess the resiliency of your fraud defenses. This is the best way to find the weak points in your organization. This can be a cost, but it's definitely worth something to do. And if you're at a larger company, I would assume your board of directors is already demanding this, or they will demand it. So let's make sure we're on top of that. And then we'll get into technology. I would say right sizing technology. Supplier portals could be used to minimize manual data entry and intervention in payments related workflow that could mitigate some of those risks. Look to optimize technology that optimizes the end-to-end payments process, gives you the visibility, gives you the bottlenecks, gives you the audit trail. If we can get it in the technology, we can automate internal and external controls and even policy compliance. From my perspective, you should minimize the number of people involved in payments processing, consistent with your segregation of duties, and you should also mitigate the number of systems that are involved in payments processing. So quite a bit to absorb. I'm going to go ahead and launch our final polling question. Again, the main goal of our time together today was to get you to take a look in the mirror, to think, to really take an action. Do you want to ask a question, go online, do some research, have a conversation with a colleague? There's just so much to cover here. Again, there's some great resources for you to take a look at in the hyperlinks that I have. Again, the study by Strategic Treasurer is one that I always look to, and they have great content as well. And then TrustBear is really doing some good work in the area as well. So make sure that you take a look at that and empower your team to do the same. Also want to once again thank my webinar partner today, Esker. They have a lot of great thought leadership resources on their website. I go to their website to stay on top of my game in several areas. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for just another few seconds. I have to do the countdown one more time before I watch some games in a little bit. 3, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. All right, and then I want to also just in closing, I am the chief evangelist. I've created a community called the Finance Collective. It's really a place where everyone belongs, and it's a place for people to develop and help others develop their human skills, which are soft skills. So those are the two pillars: human skills, soft skills all day long. A place where everybody has a place to shine up and across the office of the CFO. In the short survey that follows after the webinar, I'll ask you if you're interested in learning more about the Finance Collective community and maybe being featured in the Finance Collective community as well. We want to share success stories up, down, and across the office of the CFO. To everyone, enjoy your March Madness time. I know everyone is not going to spend any time at work watching the tournament. Root the Boilers on. Make the rest of your day great, everyone.